Australia is one of the most multicultural countries on the planet.
Almost 1 in 3 of us now is born overseas, Joe. And more than 1 in 4 of us speaks a language other than English at home.
Today's guest is at the forefront of making sure everyone in New South Wales feels welcome.
With 307 different ancestries, 220 different languages and 130 different faiths, our job is to help be the glue to keep us united and strong.
Never in doubt. Joseph Posta shares his journey from leader in the white, male-dominated sports industry in Australia.
If women represent 51% of the population, why wouldn't you have a leadership team that was reflective of the community that's there to serve? I'm sort of sitting there around at the Christmas event and every single guy was heterosexual male, had played the game, was aged between 26 and 45. And the only differences to most of us were the different types of beer we drank. But we all drank beer. With that sameness, when people tried to disrupt that thinking, we were really threatened. And anyone that came in to try and say, hey, it's not just about this, there's a different way, we made their lives probably more difficult than they needed to be. So what that meant was that similarity actually was a real barrier to other people coming in to bring different ideas.
To building one of the most diverse and inclusive workforces in the country.
Your business success, whether you're a not-for-profit, the government, a corporate, will be largely dependent on how well you can engage culturally, linguistically and religiously diverse communities.
If you're a little bit curious like me and you love hearing from some super smart people, I think you'll get a lot out of this show. Welcome to The Thought Follower. I'm Joe Mackay. I've always had a lot of questions about life, and this show is my quest to find some answers. Each week I'll chat to a thought leader to hear what's going on in their space. Let's jump into the next episode. My guest on the show today is an advisory board member of the United Nations Association of New South Wales. He's former chair of Sport New South Wales and is currently the CEO of Multicultural New South Wales. Joseph Posta, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
I've followed your journey for a while and we've known each other for a while. So you studied town planning at uni?
Yeah, RMIT in Melbourne. I grew up in a suburb called Fairfield in Melbourne and went to Baldwin High, and then I was the first person in my family to ever go to university. Years later, after starting town planning, I think in the millennial year of 2000, and finished it 6 months after everyone else because I was a little bit slow at uni, but I had a lot of fun.
So you worked in that space for a little while and then you ended up at AFL New South Wales ACT, I think in 2011.
Yeah, 2009 I started, and then in 2011 I was promoted into the planning and operations role, which is the equivalent of the chief operating officer under the then general manager.
How old were you then?
27.
What did that feel like?
Exhilarating and frightening. So there's a guy called Dale Holmes, who was the CEO, and Dale's one of the great salespeople of all time. And he became the chief executive officer of the GWS Giants. And when he moved across, a guy called Dave Matthews, who was the head of game development at the time, moved up to Sydney. And Andrew Demetrio, had this amazing right-hand man. He was called the executive assistant, Tony Peake. And he came up to Sydney one day and he sat down pretty much with the entire leadership. Man, I was petrified. And he sat down with Dave and he said, no, this guy, his ability to be able to sell, excite you about the game, and just his knowledge and his contacts, we've got to think of a way to get this guy to help more, not just in the facility space, but right across the game development space. At the same time, Tom Harley had sort of finished his AFL career and Felicity Harley. And so Dave sort of put Tom as the general manager and me as the second in charge. It was a great person for me because as good a talker as I was, Tom was a wonderful leader. It was our job to grow the game, Joe.
Yeah.
Starting from very little. The first couple of years, it was all growth. 26% in the first year. And then we backed that up with another 20% in the second year. So the growth of the game in those 2 years, in 2011, 2012, particularly with the Swans winning the flag and doing well.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. A lot of the guys that we worked with, really similar philosophies and mindsets that had played the game, understood the game, and had great success in recruiting kids. But that's not the end of the story,
Yeah. And so you said it was kind of exciting and frightening. What were the frightening bits?
The fact you're now responsible for 25 million and 100 staff. Everyone's got a story, Joe. Like everyone's going through a bump. Everyone's going through a tough time at home. So we had everything from staff being arrested from child grooming to staff that were really unwell, that were needing immediate and emergency medical support, families that were breaking up, families that were making, children that were born, all of those things. It's the size of the business and you're trying to juggle all of that whilst also fulfill the hopes and aspirations of the AFL, which would grow the game. So for a young guy that was not even 30, it was one of the steepest learning curves I could have imagined.
How did you cope with that?
I didn't. There's times I did, and there was times I didn't. I lost a marriage out of it because I just was so focused on work, and it became all consuming. And there was, I remember there was one day I'd been working for 36 or 37 days straight, and I loved it. Like, I loved it, but it was like win at all costs philosophy. It meant that only a certain type of people could work with us. And it also burnt me at home because I was so in love with my job and passionate about my job, and it took over my whole being. And I remember when I left the AFL, I was lost. I was lost because I just didn't have that sense of belonging and purpose. But at the time, you just knew no other way. You just kept going and going and going. I think they've done a lot now around managing that work-life balance in the league. But at the time, It was win at all costs,
You touched on this a little bit earlier, that there was a group of really talented but ultimately pretty similar people leading that space. You surrounded yourself with sameness to get through those times. When did you realize that wasn't necessarily a strategy that was going to work long term?
It was Christmas one year. The thing that I realized was we're sort of sitting there around at the Christmas event, and every single guy was heterosexual male, had played the game, was aged between 26 and 45. And the only differences to most of us were the different types of beer we drank. But we all drank beer, which was great. So in terms of that camaraderie, that sense of belonging, having each other's back, and the philosophies that we approached, it was exciting. And so we're able to generate this real enthusiasm to the game. But with that likeness and that sameness, when people tried to disrupt that thinking, we were really threatened. And then what we found just as quickly is in a city like Sydney, where there's so many different sports and elite franchises, as quickly as we're recruiting these kids, we're losing them out the back door and we couldn't retain them. So in terms of a long-term investment, which was the whole vision of this, get a footy in their hands, indoctrinate them, get them to love the game, not just the game, but the values that sit around the game, give them a connection to the elite product that very few others in the wake. Like, it was all masterful in terms of how it's structured. We're losing kids. And anyone that came in to try and say, hey, it's not just about this, there's a different way, we made their lives probably more difficult than they needed to be. So what that meant was that similarity actually was a real barrier to other people coming in to bring different ideas. But if we went back in time, I would have completely have done things differently to allow them to come in and disrupt our thinking. Who we were attracting to the business was very much like the people that were already there, because I think it would have been really beneficial. And if we'd embraced some of those things a bit differently, we would have probably had a lot of better business outcomes than we did at the time.
It's really interesting, because a lot of people talk about the power of sport to bring people together. But something that struck me recently, I went to Mardi Gras at SCG, and the normal experience of going to the SCG is everyone in red and white, everyone looking the same. It's all about being together in that way, versus walking to the SCG for Mardi Gras, which is the polar opposite of that. Like, come as you are, whatever that looks like, all the colours of the rainbow. And for me, like, sitting in that very familiar context of like the SCG, where it's all about I'm on this side and you're on that side, and versus this celebration of their differences in a way. Like, that really had a massive impact on me, as seeing how, yes, sport does a great job of bringing people together, but it is often about surrounding yourself with sameness or with likeness, and how there's room to grow in that area.
I don't want to harp on this, mate, but one of the big eye-openers for me working at the AFL was when Adam Goodes went through what he went through. We all loved Goodsy until he told us what we didn't want to hear, and made us feel uncomfortable about that. And that uncomfortableness that we were feeling, that's 1% of what he was feeling each and every day, carrying what he was carrying. And that's why I'm so pleased that the AFL is doing a hell of a lot of work with the LGBTIQ community. They've still got a long way to go. There's some really shining examples, people like Ali Farage and people within some of the clubland that are doing some great work, making sure they mirror the communities they're there to engage. But I think, Joe, to your point, sport can be an amazing vehicle for inclusion. I think there's two things for the AFL. One is to get to a point where players feel safe being able to express their sexual orientation, and we're not there yet. And the second is mirroring the community there to serve in terms of that cultural diversity space, because I'd argue that's their fastest growing customer base. And if they're not thinking about how to engage tomorrow's fans, they're stuck in yesterday's ideals.
Hey, it's Joe here. I hope you're enjoying the episode. Every chat in season 1 of The Thought Follower is very different. I've talked to creatives, economists, elite athletes, CEOs, venture capitalists, and a bunch more along the way. You never quite know what you're going to get, so make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you don't miss an episode. Let's get back to the chat. Back to the AFL, you surround yourself with sameness, something's happened and you realise it's time for a change. To where you are now, multicultural New South Wales, which I guess almost by definition is the polar opposite of that. What was the catalyst for that change, and how did you go through that?
I got to work with some amazing leaders. And what it taught me, Joe, was that within multicultural Indigenous communities, you don't have to be the subject matter expert. You just have to be a great connector of people. And that's what wins hearts and minds. Like, if you're willing to have different conversations and let different people express themselves and feel safe and bring that magic, by jingoes, you'll be a lot more richer for it. I thought every conversation had to be linear. It had to have a start. It had to have what were the actions you needed to cover. And then it had to have the end, which was the wrap up. And then you get on and do the thing. And I learned that some of the richest conversations were actually the most unstructured, the most free-flowing, the most where people could add different ingredients into the mix. And I was sitting down with a minister from the Indian government. He said, we're not a curry, mate, because a curry implies that we all boil down to one thing. We're actually a salad, right? Bit of cucumber, bit of tomato, bit of lettuce, bit of spinach, bit of dressing. If you allow each of the different ingredients to flourish in the salad and you can strike the right balance, then you've got a really colourful, tasty dish, that you're going to enjoy. And that stuck with me a lot. So I think that aha moment at the AFL was about, okay, well, if I can really elevate this part of the business and get partnerships with government and community and corporate in this space, which we did, then I'm going to hopefully create a difference to who becomes a fan, who becomes a supporter, who gets onto these clubs' lists. And the AFL was incredibly good at fast-tracking Indigenous talent. But in terms of the actual Indigenous participation base, it was really lean. The largest Indigenous population in Australia is in Western Sydney. So if we're not engaging those young kids today and then helping put them on the right path, not just as players, but as better people, I just thought we were missing the boat. So that was my aha moment, Joe, probably working with some inspiring women and inspiring leaders of community and then getting them to help show me the way and then just doing whatever I could to break down the barriers that were in their way to do good stuff.
And so to put it in context, like just how multicultural is New South Wales?
So believe it or not, but 1 in 2 of us were either born overseas or has a parent born overseas. Almost 1 in 3 of us now is born overseas, Joe. And more than 1 in 4 of us speaks a language other than English at home. Your business success, whether you're a not-for-profit, the government, a corporate, will be largely dependent on how well you can engage culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse communities. 2016 was a real turning point for us as a country because up until that point, our number 1 and 2 countries of migration were New Zealand and England, where people were coming from. Mm-hmm. That flipped on its head in 2016 to now be India and China, China and India. And as a country, the policy of the federal government is to take 400,000 new migrants a year because that's what we need to be able to sustain ourselves in terms of our quality of life as a country. And about half of that 400,000 is going to reside in New South Wales. Okay. That suggests to me that stat's only going to go up. So I think it's incumbent upon every business to be thinking about how they're engaging that. Not just, we had a Lunar New Year event or we celebrated Ramadan. Authentically, what are you doing to understand those communities? Mirroring the community you're there to serve in terms of the look and feel of the people that you have working. And then the last thing is allowing that ideation and that difference to flourish. And that's not easy, but allowing it to flourish. Because if you do, I think that's where that thought leadership piece will come from.
What's the purpose of Multicultural New South Wales? Why do you guys exist?
We exist because we're under legislation that allows us to report directly up through the minister and to the premier. And we exist to deliver on the multicultural principles. So there's actually legislation in place that says as a state, you're free to profess your different cultural, linguistic and religious differences, but you must adhere to Australian law. So our job is to help educate people on that and ensure that that actually works, because with 307 different ancestries, 220 different languages and 130 different faiths, there's a lot of ingredients in the salad. So our job is to help make sure that that works and to be the glue that sort of binds us. Now, that could be everything from essential services in language like interpreters into the courtrooms, support to the police when people coming across that don't speak English. How do we make sure they've got access and equity? Stopping extremist forces trying to divide us in terms of alt-left, alt-right ideologies and keeping us together through the principles of democracy and leadership and resilience to keep us united and strong. I'm a firm believer that it's not just about saying the right things and sort of that really progressive ideology. There is a balance to this stuff. But equally, it's also not about dismissing some of the really conservative ideologies that have kept us in good stead and kept us connected as society and making those people feel polarised or marginalised because they have a different view. It's about the ability to be able to express all those different views and then try and find a common element or a togetherness that we can sort of land on.
Why does that purpose matter to you?
I'm the product of grandparents who came here with very little and worked 2 or 3 jobs every single day to create wealth to buy property. There's no part of me that has any sense of entitlement, and I now live a privileged life because of that. But if we've got this mindset that migrants are going to come to Australia and do what my grandparents did. We're deluded. We're not deluded because these migrants have a different ethos to work. We're not. We're deluded because when my family came to Australia, there was an abundance of primary manufacturing jobs. At that time, Holden, Ford, Toyota, they're all doing primary manufacturing here in Australia. Like 90% of jobs were primary manufacturing jobs that were about building things. Today, 90% of jobs require further education. They require either a TAFE or a diploma or a university degree. And the worst thing about our country, in my opinion, is you could be a doctor operating in Syria or in Iraq. You could have gone to the University of Damascus, one of the leading universities in the world, and your qualifications are not recognised in Australia. Now, I'm not sitting there saying we should take every doctor from every different part of the world, bung them into an Australian or a New South Wales hospital system and say, hey, presto, this is going to work. We shouldn't. But to ask these people to go right back to the start, I just think is a massive disservice. Ironically, some of these people lecture at the universities in Australia, some of the best universities in the world, like University of New South Wales and Sydney University. They come and lecture to the medical students, but they can't then go into the hospitals and be the doctor. And so I think today it's really easy for us to get caught up in a negative cycle that these people aren't contributing. But I actually think we've got to understand what their barriers to participation in. The more you talk to an Uber driver or a taxi driver, the more you realize they're not an Uber driver. They're an engineer that's looking for work, or they're looking for this, or they're finishing their qualification to be able to get back into their profession. And I think there's something as a country that we can continue to do to fast track those skills so they can do the thing that we know they're qualified to do and really add value.
I couldn't agree more. It's very important, big subject matter. One other thing that we're really passionate about is diversity and inclusion. And I've got some stats here which point to that. I think the advisory board at Multicultural New South Wales is now more than 50% female. Your senior leadership team is majority female as well. And I think most interestingly, you've got one of the most engaged staff cohorts in the whole state public service. I think you're sitting at 80% engagement rate as a workforce. Why are you passionate about diversity and inclusion, and what impact has it had on the business?
Well, thanks. Some of that stuff I didn't know, but that's good to know. I'm a firm believer that you're there to mirror the community you're there to serve. In a gender sense, if women represent 51% of the population, why wouldn't you have a leadership team that was reflective of the community that's there to serve? I also think women and men, they think differently and they bring different things to the equation just by virtue of their composition and their lived experience and those sorts of things. And if you've got the right balance of people sitting around the table, so you don't just have one of, that sort of psychological safety that can sit around different ideals, different people there that feel safe to be able to bring their whole selves and bring those different perspectives to the table, you're starting from a real position of strength. There's a guy called Troy Roderick who I did a lot of work with, who was the global head of diversity and inclusion at Telstra. And he sort of talks about the ingredients to what is an inclusive workplace. Of course, having diversity is important, but he really hones it in around bias. It's about understanding what is the wiring in terms of how you're wired that you're bringing to the table. And how does that at times stop you or shut you down to different perspectives or make you defensive? That's probably one of the most important things to learn, that if you create an environment that's safe for difference to flourish and you welcome that, and you celebrate when that diversity of thought comes, through a robust conversation, but they engineer a better outcome. And then you understand the different biases that people bring. I think that's where the magic happens. And so at an organisation like Multicultural New South Wales, where you really should be mirroring the community you're there to serve. And Joe, mate, we're not perfect. Like for the first time in our SLT, we've now got someone with the lived experience who came as a refugee. We need more of that. We need that lived experience that comes from those refugee perspectives, from having different sexual orientation at the table and those different perspectives. We need more women of colour at the table to make sure that they're helping us understand those different lived experiences that come and the bias, the perspectives and the barriers to participation because of the story that they've got in their own mind and also the story that society has about what these people can and can't bring to the table. So I'm a firm believer that if you employ the right different mixes of people, you give them the tools to do their job and you get the heck out of their way, that the rest will take care of itself. And I think if you've got people that feel really passionate and connected to their work, they'll do the overs and they'll give you that discretionary effort. And I think that's where the magic happens, because you don't need to then grow your workforce by 10 or 20% to be able to get those stretch targets and ideals. Your staff that are there will deliver it for you, but you need to be able to celebrate that and recognise that and acknowledge that discretionary effort, not just assume it's par for the course because everyone else is doing it as well.
As the CEO, is there anything that you do to enable that discretionary effort, or what are the steps that you take to keep your staff engaged?
Part of my role is for them to know that I care. I don't just care about them as the head of policy or the finance guy or the HR person. I care about them as the mother of 2 young kids and one of them's going through a bumpy time. I care about them as the person in comms who's just lost their dog and how important their dogs are to their identity and those things. Like, I care at that level. I argue that I'm the dumbest person on our senior leadership team. So in terms of IQ, I have probably the lowest IQ. I surround myself with really smart, intelligent people, and they make me look incredibly good. But in terms of EQ, in terms of emotional intelligence, I reckon I can feel the tension from the mouse that is in the cupboard that no one even knows exists. And that's where I add value. If I feel that someone's been maybe a little bit dominant in a meeting and that's then imposed itself on someone else and that's helping disrupt where we need to get to collectively, I'll try and create a language or a framework that then lets us walk back from that to allow that other person to have their difference. And I think the team really thrived because of that. They couldn't be more different in terms of their lifestyles from what my AFL experience was. But in terms of their sense of connection and their sense of having each other's back, they're probably arguably more connected than that team was, even though they're more different. And I think that's really special. And that's a safe space that I try and really nourish and protect.
Hey, it's me again. If you've made it this far, I'm guessing you're enjoying the chat. Don't forget to give the Thought Follower a rating and share it with your friends. Otherwise, reach out to me on LinkedIn with any guest suggestions or feedback on the show. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get back to the episode. What do you measure yourself on day to day or at the end of a year? How do you reflect on your performance?
The first thing is there's a philosophy I carry every day into my job. The philosophy is pretty simple, that I've got a nice office. I'm chief executive. My philosophy is, good on you, mate. You've earned the right to walk into this office and have someone ask you if you want a coffee, or go and get someone a coffee and have a chat with whoever, but you've got to earn the chair. Because if you're not earning the chair each and every day, someone else should be in that chair. That's just purely my philosophy. That's what probably keeps me hungry. It stops me being from complacent. And probably the thing that at 3 or 4 o'clock where we all start to drift off and I sit there and I go, nail this. Or make that phone call that you know is going to be difficult, or reach out to that stakeholder because you're thinking they might have been through a bumpy time because of, you know, what's just happened in that part of the world or that part of the world, or what's happened on the airport in Sydney even the other day. That's the sort of mindset that drives me each and every day. And I think that naturally bleeds across the team because they don't sit there and go, oh, no, he's comfortable.
How do you make that judgment of whether you've earned that chair for another day?
The judgment really needs to come from community. So when I get an email that says to me, your team did this the other day and that person's now, their sense of belonging or their sense of belief or that program's helped them in doing this, I sit there and go, yeah, tick. That's what matters to us. There's a lot of people out there that are fairly happy giving you feedback that suggests you're not doing the thing that you should. And you've got to sometimes take that with a grain of salt. Or sometimes I use that as a driver and a motivation to sit there and go, okay, well, if I can get them to see a couple of things in what we're doing that might be valuable, then I've done a really good job. Equally, if I've got the people that love us, that want more of us, and they're at a point where they're feeling supported and understood, that's a good thing too. So there's a spectrum of what it is to be satisfactory. And it works, Joe, because that's the stuff that gets to the minister or the premier or something. They'll tell those leaders of the state whether we are or aren't doing the job that we should. And normally those people will sit back and go, yeah, no, I got some good feedback, or I got some other feedback that suggests you're not doing enough. And half the time I'll sit there and go, that's exactly right. Do you want us to look at that more? Do you want us to spend more time with that community? And if the answer is yes, then we will. If the answer is hang on, that might spread you a bit thin, or you've got to keep a consistent standard, then we take that on board as well.
Are there kind of habits or routines or steps that you take personally to be able to show up at work the way you want to every day?
Not habits, but I know when it goes wrong and I know when I'm getting wobbly. You're a dad of young kids and that's something we share and something that we're both really passionate about. And when I'm neglecting home, work's not great, because that's when it starts to feel like it's a trade-off. When I started at Multicultural New South Wales in 2019, within 3 months, we'd had 3 global terrorism incidents. We'd had the Christchurch massacre, which had a massive impact on our community. We had the San Diego synagogue bombings, which had a massive impact on our Jewish community. And then when Easter hits and we're all starting to think that we're fine, we have the Sri Lankan bombings, which then creates a massive challenge, not just within our Sri Lankan communities, but our Christian communities right across the world. When these things happen globally, they have a massive ripple effect in a multicultural society like New South Wales and in Australia. So I'm 3 months into the job and I've had 3 global terrorism incidents. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, what is going on? And then we have bushfires and we're watching this incredible heroism of some of our communities that are going to feed people in far-flung parts of the state that they probably didn't even know existed 3 months ago, but now they're carting meals out to them, taking blankets, offering support, clothing, whatever. I'm thinking, wow, this is great. And then bang, Joe, COVID. You know,
Mhm.
but I remember watching the number of dead bodies getting wheeled out of northern Italy. Like, we wonder why we had some of the fastest vaccination rates on earth in
Mm.
places like Blacktown and Winston Hills and Seven Hills. It's because our Indian diaspora had seen what had happened back home in Mumbai and Kolkata and Hyderabad and did not want that to happen here. And so any vaccination they could get into their arm, they would, because they knew the risk of what happened if you weren't vaccinated. All of these things taught me this amazing resilience. But I also know during COVID, I missed the first 6 months of my daughter's life. And so I'm still jaded about that, not because I didn't have to do my job. I was really proud of the work we did during COVID. But I know when I'm neglecting my family, it has an impact on who I am being at work. So it's about that balance. It's about being able to pick the kids up from school or drop them off. But equally, it's also staying back late when you need to, when under siege or you're under pressure, or there's something that's a significant issue within community you need to navigate.
So you touched on your EQ, or like that strong sense of what others around you are feeling. And you talked there about when you're serving a community that is literally everyone in this state, and all the different incidents and things that can happen around the world that have some impact on some of your community. Does that take a toll on you personally? Like, how do you get away from that and recharge and reset day to day?
Yes. I like people, and that helps. And probably somewhere deep down in my psychological review, if you were to ever psychoanalyze me, there's probably a part of me growing up that never really felt a sense of belonging in either the Australian or the Italian communities. So I was hell-bent on being liked, and I liked being liked.
Hmm.
You know, over time, I've learnt the difference between what it is to be liked and be respected, but that really drives me, that want to connect with humans on a human level and have that connection and build that trust. Does that take a toll? Yeah. Particularly when, Joe, you walk away from an engagement that's bumpy. They've walked away thinking you haven't respected or understood their point of view, or there's a real disconnect there, or that you have respected and understood their point of view, but you've still delivered them the sad music that we're pushing ahead in that direction anyway. You and I could have a really robust conversation, and we get off the phone and go, well, hang on, we've known each other for 15 years. Can't be that bad. You know, I text you the next morning, you okay, off the back of our bumpy conversation. Other people might take days or weeks to digest and process that. So it's just respecting that people process information and deal with information differently, and that your way isn't always the right way. And you can learn a lot from other people and how they digest and process information as well. In terms of self-help and self-care, I think it's about finding the things that you enjoy and doing them a lot. If it's bike riding, if it's swimming, if it's going for a kick of the footy, if it's playing with the kids or teaching them how to ride their bike, or just even pushing them on the swings, it seems to bring kids an enormous amount of laughter. And I like seeing you smile as I say that to you, because that's the sort of stuff that helps balance out the rest of the stuff. But I love my job. It's a difficult job, but it's a really worthwhile job. And I think as long as you love what you do, that helps as well. It's not like you feel like you're a prisoner to have to turn up. Now, that's not to say I don't go through good and bad days. Absolutely, I do. And sometimes I don't get any of that right, and I take that out on my staff. But I've got the strength of relationship to then be able to sort of sit back down with them and go, sorry, I was a real, pain in the ass yesterday, or I could have handled that so much better. And I'll go, yeah, you probably could have. We could have too. And, let's take that as a learning and take it forward.
So I'm obviously a proud member of New South Wales and part of the community. And some of those stats you mentioned, this dawned on me the other day. My wife's born overseas. My son is born overseas. We speak a second language at home. I'm very much in this community. What can I be doing, or should I be doing to help? Like, how do people listening get involved or support?
I think you do. I think even the willingness to have me on a thing like this demonstrates that you're open to the ideals of diversity and inclusion, that you think that one way is not the right way. That's probably my message out of today is I went from someone that was really hardworking and focused to think that my way was the right way, to now realize that there's many ways. And there's often not right or wrong. There's just different ways of doing things. And the more open to that difference we are, the better we are for it. So be someone that's willing to have different conversations with different people. The other thing is I like turning bystanders into upstanders. So if you see something down in your part of the world, in the Illawarra, you sit there and you go, hang on a second, that's made that person feel really shit. Or hang on, that's not what Australia is about. You see something that you think is racist, not necessarily tackle the person that's impacted the racism, that's influenced the conversation. Go and just support the person that's copped it. That's such an important thing to do. And that takes you from a bystander to an upstander. Just go around them and just sit there, or say to that person, hang on, mate, just calm down or settle down, or are you okay? Like, clearly if this person's aggravated. But I think that's going to make us stronger as a society. And I think the thing that we can't underestimate is that things like racism and discrimination, they are a massive handbrake on our society. They're a massive handbrake. They will stop young and talented people wanting to come to this country and make a positive contribution. They'll stop young and talented people that are in this country from making a positive contribution because they fear for their own safety or their kids' safety or their family's safety. And the one thing I'd say to listeners is if you are in that moment, you got a choice, yeah? And it's not easy. And I'm not saying put yourself in a dangerous situation, quite the opposite. Don't tackle the perpetrator if that's not the right thing, but just show some support to the person that's been there so that they don't feel like they're alone. They feel like it's an individual thing. It's not a societal thing. And the more that society can support often those victims, I think the quicker they'll recover from it. And Joe, there's been instances where probably you and I both have been in really shitty situations that we could still tell people about today that happened years and months ago. And I think those people that are different, that look visibly different, we can't underestimate that some of the time they are exposed to things that are really shitty. And as a society, it's incumbent upon all of us to remind us about what's good about what the people are that live around them.
Yeah, 100%. That's well said. Mate, thank you for all the work that you guys and all the team at Multicultural New South Wales are doing. It was good to chat to you more about it today and hear what you're up to. Thanks for joining the show.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support me or the show, best way is to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And please get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you with any guest recommendations or feedback on the show. See you on the next one.